Tonight, I want to tell you a story that didn't end when the war did. In 2021, an old army footlocker was discovered in the back room of a small store in rural Kentucky. Dusty, locked, untouched for nearly 8 decades. Inside it were a uniform, dog tags, a Purple Heart, and dozens of letters. Letters written by a soldier who never made it home. Letters no one living had ever seen. They were written by First Lieutenant Johnnie William Elmore, United States Army. He served in Europe in 1944 and was killed at age 31. When he left for war, his daughter was just 11 months old. She grew up never knowing the sound of his voice, only the silence where he should have been. These letters waited 77 years to return to her hands. This is their story, and his. My name is Velda, though for most of my life, that name felt like something floating unconnected in time. As if I had been cut loose from something I was supposed to know. I grew up hearing that my father was a soldier, that he died in World War II, that he was brave, that he served his country. People said those things gently, respectfully, the way one speaks about someone who can no longer answer for themselves. But no matter how many times I heard those words, they were never enough for me to know him. You see, I never heard his voice. I never sat in his lap. I have no memory of his face bending down toward mine. When he left for war, I was 11 months old, too young to remember him, old enough to live my entire life with the shape of his absence. His name was First Lieutenant Johnnie William Elmore, born October 10, 1913, in the quiet countryside of Butler County, Kentucky. A land of rolling hills, tobacco barns, gravel roads, and Sunday mornings where the church bell was the loudest sound for miles. He grew up during the final years of the First World War, though the front lines felt a world away from rural Kentucky. The Great Depression hit when he was still a teenager, and like many families here, his did what they could. They farmed what they could. They fixed what they could. And when something broke beyond repair, they learned to go without. People who knew him back then say he had a calmness to him, a steady way of walking, of listening, of looking people in the eye, the kind of young man others trusted without needing to explain why. He attended Western Kentucky State Teachers College, what we call WKU today, and joined the Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC. That program was meant to prepare teachers and students to serve as officers if the country ever needed them. It was a quiet kind of preparation, no fanfare, no speeches, just discipline, understanding, responsibility. He earned his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army Reserve in 1935, and for a time he didn't go to war at all. He taught young cadets at Indiana University in Bloomington, students just a few years younger than he was. They drilled in open fields, studied maps, learned how to lead men, not just command them. Those who trained with him remembered something simple. He didn't teach to impress, he taught to prepare. And then, like so many lives of that generation, everything changed on December 7th, 1941. News of Pearl Harbor spread across the country like a storm rolling in without warning. Radios snapped on. Families gathered in living rooms. The United States was no longer watching the war from a distance. We were in the war. My father didn't hesitate. He reported for active duty. Around that same time, he met my mother, Mary, a quiet woman with soft dark hair and a way of smiling like she knew something gentle about the world. She always said that loving him felt simple, not dramatic, not grand, just right. They married. And shortly after, the war began shaping their life together, the way a river shapes a shoreline. Not all at once, but steadily. My mother would later tell me that when she learned she was expecting a baby, me, she felt joy and fear at the same time. She worried the war would take him before I took my first steps. She hoped he would come home in time to teach me how to walk. But the war did not move according to any family's hopes. By early 1944, my father was stationed stateside, training for deployment. I was born that spring. He held me once, just once, in a small room lit by a single lamp. He touched my hair, he said my name, he whispered something to me that my mother never heard. A private message between a father and daughter, spoken into the very beginning of my life. In the summer of 1944, After the D-Day landings in Normandy, the army needed officers to reinforce the infantry units fighting across France. My father was promoted to first lieutenant and ordered to deploy. He packed his duffel bag. He kissed my mother. He touched my cheek. He promised he would come home. My mother told me that story many times. How she stood on the train platform holding me. How she tried not to cry. How she waved even after the train had already disappeared behind the trees. But here is the part she never told me until much later. She said I was smiling. She said I waved too. No memories remain of that moment inside my mind, but something inside me believes it. A connection does not need memory to be real. As he crossed the Atlantic, he began writing letters, dozens of them, from training camps in New Jersey, then from staging grounds in England, and finally from the cold, muddy fields of France during the final winter of the war. Letters filled with longing, letters full of small details, letters written to a baby who could not yet read them. He called me Froggy. No one knows exactly why. Maybe because I was small. Maybe because babies curl their legs like frogs. Or maybe because it made him smile during the kind of days when smiles were hard to find. For years I never knew that name existed. For years no one did, because those letters, every single one of them, were sealed away inside an old army footlocker. Locked, forgotten, waiting for 77 years. When my father boarded the transport ship to Europe in the fall of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its most difficult chapter. The Allies had broken through Normandy in June, liberated Paris in August, and were pushing east toward the German border. But victory was not yet close, not the way history sometimes makes it seem. Soldiers would tell you that hope is not the same thing as certainty, and the winter of 1944 was one of the coldest in memory. The journey across the Atlantic took nearly 2 weeks. Those ships did not move in straight lines. They zigzagged to avoid German U-boats, changing course every few minutes, day and night. Men slept in stacked metal bunks, 4 or 5 high, the air thick with sweat and sea salt and wool. My father wrote that the ship rocked like the world was breathing, and that every time he closed his eyes, he saw my face. He wrote, "It is strange to love someone you do not yet know, but I feel I know you just the same. I imagine the weight of you in my arms. I imagine the sound you make when you wake." He wrote to my mother every day, even when he could not mail the letters. One letter, dated October 18, 1944, reads, "The ocean is grey today, so grey that the horizon disappears. It reminds me of early mornings in Kentucky before the sun lifts the fog. Do me a kindness, hold Froggy for me today. Tell her that her father is thinking of her." I did not hear those words until I was 77 years old, but when I finally did, I felt the truth of them inside my bones. Arrival in England. My father's unit arrived first in England, where soldiers were processed, assigned equipment, and prepared to join the fight on the Western Front. The countryside there was damp, the air heavy with coal smoke, stone buildings darkened by years of fog and war weariness. British children waved at American troops from sidewalks, calling out, "Got any gum? Any chocolate?" as American soldiers tossed them ration candies, small moments of warmth inside a world made of uncertainty. While stationed near Southampton, my father wrote about the rain, the mud, the smell of wool coats drying by small stoves in crowded barracks. But even in those conditions, he found gentleness. He wrote, "I saw a man carve a wooden toy horse from scrapwood today. He gave it to a French boy who had lost his home. The war is not just what men do to one another. It is also the small things we try to give back." He was assigned to an infantry regiment preparing to reinforce the front near the Ardennes, where the forests grew dense and dark. No one knew it yet, but something terrible was forming. Something history would later call the Battle of the Bulge. But before that, something quieter happened. My father wrote a letter for me. It was dated November 3rd, 1944, written on thin army stationery. The ink faded but clear. "Hello, Froggy. I do not know if you will ever read this. I hope you will. I hope I will be there to hand it to you myself. I saw your picture today. You are standing now, they tell me. I wonder if you will remember the sound of my voice. I hope I return before memory begins. That sentence, I hope I return before memory begins. It holds a softness I didn't know was possible inside war. Into France. In late November, his unit crossed the English Channel and came ashore in northern France. The war had moved fast that year, but the land still bore its scars. Fields torn open by artillery, fences chewed to splinters, church towers crumbled, and homes standing roofless, like open wounds. It was there, near the border of Luxembourg, that winter arrived early. Snow fell thick and wet, and the cold cut through wool coats as if they were paper. Soldiers learned to sleep sitting upright, rifles propped under armpits to keep them from freezing. Canteens iced over, boots stiffened. The forest was so quiet at night that you could hear your own heartbeat, and sometimes the distant rumble of artillery rolling like thunder across the ground. My father wrote fewer letters then, not because he forgot, but because time shrank. The front consumes hours the way fire consumes wood. Still, he wrote, "Mary, tell Froggy I'm trying to get home. That is what keeps me warm." He was 31 years old, barely older than many of the men he led. He was responsible for keeping them alive. A lieutenant carries more than his own fear. He carries the weight of every man who looks at him for direction. And yet his letters home were gentle. No bitterness, no anger, no hatred of the men he fought against. Just longing and hope and a constant, fragile thread of love stretched across an ocean. A winter of waiting. As the days shortened toward December, rumours spread through the ranks. The Germans were gathering, moving, preparing something. But soldiers are always hearing rumours. You learn to trust only what is in front of you. Your men, your rifle, your breath in the cold air. Meanwhile, back home, my mother kept every letter in a wooden box beside her bed. When snow fell in Kentucky, she held me near the window and wondered if snow was falling where he was too. She once told me, "I never let myself believe he wouldn't come home, not because I was brave, because love makes its own kind of denial." Some truths are too large to fit inside a person all at once, so we learn them slowly. At this point in history, the world remembers the headlines. December 16th, 1944, Germany launched a massive surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle American forces would fight in World War II. My father was there, and soon the letters would stop. But before that, one final letter began its journey, one that would not arrive for 77 years. By early December 1944, the war had taken on the quiet, waiting tension that comes just before something breaks. Snow lay heavy on the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, thick enough to swallow the sound of footsteps. Blankets of white draped over pine branches and ruined farmhouses, turning the landscape into something that looked peaceful, if you didn't know what was coming. My father's unit had moved into defensive positions near the Ardennes. They were expecting a long winter, not a major battle. American command believed the German army was nearly defeated, exhausted, low on fuel, running out of men. The front line seemed quiet, too quiet, but soldiers learned to distrust silence. My father wrote one more letter home in those days. The date at the top reads, December 10th, 1944, somewhere in France. The army often required soldiers to use the vague phrase, somewhere in France, to protect troop positions. But we know now his unit was near Echternach, close to the Luxembourg border. He wrote, "My dear Mary, and hello again to my little Froggy. I hope she's saying new sounds. I hope there is laughter in the house. I think often about how life continues even in the middle of all this. It reminds me that there is something waiting for me, something good when this is over." He wrote about the snow, about the cold that soaked into bone, about how the nights were so quiet they seemed to echo. And then this. I do not know how much longer this will last, but I want you both to know this. I am not afraid. I think of home every day. I carry you with me. Tell Froggy that her father loves her very much. Even if she will not remember me, I hope she will feel that. There is no grand speech in those lines, no poetry, just truth spoken plainly by a man who understood his place in the world. He ended the letter with something I did not expect. If I do not return, do not let her carry sadness. Let her carry only the knowledge that she was loved from the very beginning. He was preparing for the worst, quietly, gently, without despair. The letter was mailed the next morning. It would travel across the Atlantic, across rail lines and sorting rooms and dusty mail depots, but it would not reach my mother. Not then, not in her lifetime, because 1 week later the world changed. The quiet before the storm. At dawn, on December 16th, 1944, the German army launched a massive surprise attack across the Ardennes forest. 200,000 soldiers, 1,400 tanks, and thousands of artillery guns. The sound of the bombardment rolled across the snow like the earth splitting open. American lines were thin, undermanned, underprepared. The assumption that the war would soon end turned out to be wrong. This moment would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle the United States Army has ever fought. But to the people there, in those first hours, it was not a battle. It was confusion, cold, snow, and fear that felt like iron in the lungs. My father was an infantry officer. His job was to keep his men together, to hold the line where the line was trying to break. He wrote no letters from that week. There was no time for words. December 22nd, 1944. The Army telegram arrived in Kentucky just after Christmas. A Western Union messenger walked up the snowy hill to my grandmother's house, hat in hand, face pale. Telegrams were handwritten on thin yellow paper. They did not use elaborate language. They used the same words for every soldier. The Secretary of War regrets to inform you. My father was 31 years old. 6 days after the offensive began. 6 days after his final letter. 6 days before the new year. My mother received that telegram holding me in her arms. She told me later, when I read it, I did not cry. I felt empty, like sound itself had stopped. Some grief is too large to break open right away. It settles slowly, like cold. What war leaves behind. When a soldier falls in war, the world tends to speak about numbers, troop counts, casualty lists, battlefield maps. But loss is not measured in totals. Loss is measured in empty chairs, in birthdays with one face missing, in photographs where one person is always looking at the camera instead of holding the child beside them. My father was buried in Europe at first, like many American soldiers who died there. Years later, his remains were returned to Kentucky, where he rests in a small hillside cemetery, not far from where he was born. My mother kept his picture on her dresser. She kept a wooden box with the letters she did have. She raised me with strength that I understood only much later in life. But she never remarried. She said her heart had already chosen. She passed away in 1999. For the next 22 years, I lived with a father I knew only through a photograph. The letter that never arrived. And then in 2021, during a renovation of a small old building that once belonged to our family, someone found a footlocker shoved behind crates, sealed, dust-covered, forgotten. Inside were his dog tags, his uniform, his map case, his service Bible, his Purple Heart, and dozens of letters, including the one he wrote on December 10, 1944, the one meant for me, the one that began, "Hello, Froggy," a name I had never heard before, a name that belonged only to us, a name that connected me to him instantly, like a key turning in a lock I had carried my whole life. 77 years late, but not too late. The return of that letter did not reopen an old wound. It completed something. It gave me the thing I had been missing. Not a soldier, not a symbol, but a father. A man who loved, a man who hoped, a man who tried to come home. And now, because of those letters, he has. After the telegram arrived, the world did not end. That is one of the quiet cruelties of loss. The way life continues, while the heart holds still. My mother, Mary, stayed in the same small house in Butler County, Kentucky, where she and my father had planned to raise me. The war ended in Europe on May 8, 1945, VE Day, and people poured into streets across America to celebrate. Church bells rang, flags waved, neighbours embraced one another. The world exhaled for the first time in years. But inside our house, the air remained quiet. She did not resent the celebration. She understood what peace meant. But peace is never the same for everyone. For some, it means a husband is coming home. For others, it means he is not. She was years learning how to say his name without her voice breaking. But she tried to build a life around love rather than absence. She read to me. She taught me how to tie my shoes. She braided my hair in the mornings before church. And every night, she told me stories. Not about war, but about who my father was before it. She said, "He laughed with his whole face, not just his mouth. He never rushed his words. He believed every person deserved to be heard." She told me about how he held a door open for people not out of politeness, but because he genuinely believed time should be shared. She told me he used to stand at the fence line at sunset, just to watch the light change on the fields. She told me he talked about teaching me how to throw a ball, how to fish, how to be patient in the face of frustration. She filled my childhood with a presence, even in his absence. But there were things she could not give me. The sound of his voice, the feeling of his hand guiding mine across a book page, the memory of him standing in a doorway. Those are the things loss protects most fiercely. Growing up with a name and no face. As I grew older, I learned to answer questions carefully. When a teacher would ask, "What does your father do?" I learned to say, "He served in the war," and leave it there. People would nod. They would look sympathetic, but sympathy is not the same as understanding. Other children had memories to revisit. Mine had to be imagined. Some days, that was harder than grief itself. Because grief is something you feel, but longing is something you carry. And you carry it every day. The purple heart. My grandmother kept one item locked in a small wooden drawer. My father's purple heart. There is something haunting about that medal. Not because of what it represents, but because of what it requires in order to be awarded. It means injury. It means sacrifice. It means a life cut short in service. My mother rarely touched it. She said she didn't want a medal to replace a man. When I was old enough, she placed it in my hand. It was smaller than I expected. Cool, smooth. The purple enamel glowing softly under our kitchen light. She said, "This does not mean he belonged to the war. This means he belonged to us, and we remember him." I kept it wrapped in cloth for years. I never displayed it. I didn't need it to prove anything. Grief is private. Love is too. The telegram. We kept the telegram as well. Folded, thin, the paper aging to a soft yellow. The Secretary of War regrets to inform you. There is nothing gentle in those words. They are not meant to be gentle. They are meant to be final. But a life is not final just because it has ended. There are echoes. There are traces. There are threads that reach across years waiting to be tugged back into the light. And I did not know yet that one of those threads was waiting inside a forgotten footlocker. The years pass. Time moved differently after the war. The country rebuilt. Highways stretched across farmland. New houses grew where old ones had stood. Families expanded. Televisions flickered into living rooms. The world felt faster, louder, brighter. And still, inside our house, my mother kept the pace that love demands. Slow, steady, faithful. She never remarried. Neighbours would ask why. She would smile a soft, unblaming smile and say, "Some hearts choose once." I grew into adulthood. I married. I had children of my own. And with each milestone, graduation, wedding, new life born, I felt the space where he should have stood. Not as a wound, but as a shaping. His absence became part of who I was, but not in a way that made me smaller. I think in some quiet, unspoken way, it made me larger. Because I learned young that love does not disappear when a person does. It just changes form. Late years, quiet questions. After my mother passed in 1999, I found myself returning often to the idea of him. Not the soldier, but the man. Who did he laugh with? What songs did he like? Did he tap his foot when he was thinking? Did he whistle while he walked? There were no recordings, no videos, just photographs and unanswerable questions. And yet I did not feel anger. Only a kind of soft curiosity, a wondering. What was his voice like? Was it low, warm? Did it carry Kentucky's soft drawl? I believed I would never know. The past felt sealed, closed, settled. And then the phone rang. The call. It was late August 2021 when a relative contacted me. A store building in Round Hill, Kentucky, one that once belonged to our family, was being emptied. Inside, behind a stack of old shelving, they found a steel army footlocker, olive green, the paint scratched with time. They asked, "Velda, do you want to come see it?" I did not speak at first. It felt impossible, like someone was calling from another lifetime. I drove there the next morning. The footlocker sat on the floor, dust thick on the lid, the metal cool to the touch. The latches clicked open easily, as if they had been waiting to be opened, and inside, my father was there. Not his body, not his voice, but something just as real. His handwriting, his thoughts, his humour, his tenderness, his hopes. Dozens of letters, wrapped in ribbon, stacked carefully, untouched for 77 years. And just under the top layer was the one addressed to me, the one that began, "Hello, Froggy." The room was very quiet. I touched the envelope. The world felt full again. The footlocker was heavier than I expected, not in weight exactly, but in what it carried. The metal was cool beneath my fingertips, the paint chipped from decades of quiet waiting. It smelled faintly of dust, old wood, and something else, perhaps time itself, sealed away, breathing slowly in the dark. Someone handed me a chair. No one spoke. The room felt like a church. I knelt beside the footlocker and lifted the lid. Inside lay a life interrupted, but never erased. A neatly folded olive drab uniform, threadbare at the cuffs, a pair of dog tags, the chain coiled like a still heartbeat. A Bible the size of my palm, with pages worn soft at the corners. His service cap, its shape still holding the curve of his hand. And beneath them, carefully arranged and tied with faded ribbon, were letters. Dozens, stacked in quiet patience, letter upon letter upon letter. Paper browned with age, ink still dark and certain. Letters addressed to my mother, letters addressed to my grandparents, and one small bundle, only 7 or 8 envelopes, written to a baby girl he barely had time to know. Me. He had written my name with such intention. He wrote Froggy with a looping curl in the F, like he was smiling as he wrote it. My hands trembled when I touched the first envelope. Not from sorrow. Sorrow I had long learned to live beside, but from recognition, as though the world had drawn a circle and everything had finally come back to its beginning. The first letter to me. I opened the top envelope slowly, careful not to tear the fragile paper. The words were written in a deliberate, unhurried hand. "Hello, Froggy. Your mother says you're standing now. I wish I could see that. I imagine you're small and determined, like your grandfather when he works the fields." I read that sentence over and over. He did not write to a concept of a child. He wrote to me, to my stubbornness, to my curiosity, to the person I would one day become. He continued, "I do not know the world you're growing into, but I hope it is kind to you. If I am not there to guide you, I hope these words find you one day. I hope they bring me closer to you than memory can." He was not afraid when he wrote those words. He was preparing love to travel farther than he could. I pressed the paper to my chest. A father I never remembered had just reached across 7 decades and held me. The Purple Heart. The medal lay beneath the letters in a small velvet box. Purple, gold-edged, George Washington's profile in relief. The Purple Heart is awarded to those wounded or killed in service to the United States. It is not given for heroism, not directly. It is given for sacrifice, for the price of duty paid in blood. I traced the smooth enamel with my thumb. I did not feel pride. I did not feel anger. I felt proximity to the moment his life changed, to the path that led him away from home, to the silence that followed. Opening the footlocker did not reopen grief. It gave grief a voice, and a voice is something you can hold. The small things, there were objects inside the footlocker that no official record could explain. A broken pencil stub wrapped in cloth, a sketch of a farmhouse drawn in the corner of a letter, a pressed wildflower, dry and paper thin, a map with 3 towns circled in red pencil, a photograph of a friend whose name no one now remembers. Small things, ordinary things, but that is the truth of war. History books remember battles. Families remember the quiet, the everyday, the things a man holds close when the world feels uncertain. My mother's letters returned. Some envelopes had handwriting I recognized, not my father's, but my mother's. She had written to him regularly, daily, when mail permitted, sometimes several times in a single night. but most of her letters never reached him. The war moved faster than the postal service could follow. When he was killed, they were returned to sender, sealed, unread, unaltered. She never opened them. 30 letters, unopened, still sealed. She had saved them her entire life, knowing they would hurt if opened, and hurt if thrown away. She kept them exactly as they were. Love, preserved in a language meant only for two. When I saw them, something in me understood my mother in a way I never had before. She had not carried grief alone. She had carried hope that could no longer go anywhere. But she held it anyway. That is a kind of courage history does not write about. The photograph, tucked between 2 letters, was a small photograph, worn at the edges. My father, sitting on the back steps of his childhood home, sunlight on his face, sleeves rolled, a book resting open on his knee. He looked young, relaxed, human. Not a soldier, not a symbol, not a casualty. A man. That photograph did something no monument, record or medal ever could. It made him real. Someone who had favourite foods, someone who laughed at jokes, someone who probably left coffee cups half finished around the house. Someone who had expected, fully expected, to come home. The photograph was not dramatic, but it was everything. What the letters changed. People often ask if finding the footlocker brought me closure. But closure is the wrong word. I did not need to move on. I had already lived a full life. Marriage, children, grandchildren, seasons of quiet joy and years of learning my own shape. What the footlocker gave me was continuity, a beginning that finally met its ending. A father who had always been a memory became a person. A story became a voice. A question became an answer. I had spent a lifetime imagining him. Now, in his own handwriting, he introduced himself. I did not read the letters all at once. I couldn't. Some things are not meant to be consumed the way one reads a book or finishes a film. Some things must be approached, slowly, patiently, like wading into deep water. For several weeks I kept the footlocker in my living room, close enough to see in the evening light. I would walk past it on my way to make tea, or when I opened the curtains in the morning, and I would pause, rest a hand on the lid, feeling not just the weight of the chest but the presence of the person it had carried home. One night, when the house was quiet and the sky outside was dark and still, I sat down beside the footlocker and opened it. I chose one letter, just one. It was dated October 29th, 1944, written from England. His handwriting was steady, careful. "Mary, kiss Froggy for me. I hope she's warm and well. I could hear her laugh in my head today. It made the day feel lighter." I closed my eyes. I tried to imagine his voice. Was it low, measured, soft at the edges the way Kentucky voices often are? I read the letter out loud, not to myself but to the room, as if I were reading to him. When I finished, I pressed the letter to my chest and sat still for a long time. There was no sadness in that moment, just presence, something I had never had before. Words that were never heard. In the days that followed, I read more. Letters with small details. The taste of black coffee brewed in tin mugs. The mud that clung to boots, no matter how many times they were cleaned. The sight of French children waving to American troops. The sound of church bells in English villages on Sunday mornings. He did not write about battles, not once. He wrote about moments. Moments that said, "I am still human." Moments that said, "I am still thinking of home." In one letter he wrote, "We sometimes trade stories of what we will do when this is over. One wants to run a store. Another wants to go to California and see the ocean from the sand. I want to sit on the porch with you and hold our daughter. I do not need more than that." Those words sat in my hands like something warm, not tragic, not dramatic, real. A simple life, a quiet life, a life he believed he would return to. The letter with the flower. There was one letter that moved me more than the rest. Folded inside was a pressed wildflower, so old it was almost transparent, like smoke caught on paper. The letter said, "I picked this on the road outside camp. I thought it looked brave, growing where nothing else wanted to. If Froggy is like this flower, she will do just fine." I held the flower carefully, afraid it would crumble, but it did not. 77 years old, pressed flat, delicate, but whole. Just like memory, just like love. Reading to my own children. One afternoon, I invited my son and daughter to sit with me. They are grown now, adults with lives of their own, but they came without hesitation. We sat at the dining table. Sunlight warmed the wood. I placed the letters gently in front of us. I read them aloud. As I spoke his words, slowly, letting the sound settle, I watched my children's faces. Not sadness, something gentler. They were not grieving a grandfather they never knew. They were meeting him. He became real to them in that moment. Not a soldier, not a photograph, a man. A man who wrote, "If I am gone, tell her I loved her first." My daughter reached for my hand. My son wiped his eyes and looked away, pretending he hadn't. No one said anything for a long time. We didn't need to. Some love is understood without words. The name that returned to me, the name Froggy, appeared in letter after letter. Each time, written like a whisper of affection folded into paper. I had lived 77 years without it. But when I saw it, it felt familiar, as if I had known it always, just waiting to remember. That small nickname did something profound. It returned me to the time before grief, before loss, before war reached into our home. It connected me to the girl I once was, the girl who reached her small hand toward a departing train without understanding why. It gave me back the beginning of my story, what it means to hear someone's voice without sound. We think of voice as sound, but voice is more than sound. It is rhythm, cadence, choice of words, the way someone speaks about the world. Through those letters, I heard him, clearer than memory, clearer than photographs, clearer than the way others described him. He was calm, he was thoughtful, he was earnest, he was loving, and he was so very present in his absence. The quiet realization. When I finished reading the last letter aloud, I set it down slowly. I realized something. I had spent my entire life belonging to a story I did not yet know. But now, I knew the shape of it. Not just the grief, not just the loss, but the love that came before the loss. I felt my father not as a figure of history, but as someone I had finally met, 77 years late, but exactly when I was ready. There is a moment when you finish reading the last letter, when the air around you feels different. Not heavier, not lighter, just truer, as if the room, the house, the heart have all settled into alignment. That is what happened the day I read the final letter. Not closure, not an ending, just a settling. A quiet acceptance that the story had always been whole, even when I did not know its missing pages. For most of my life, people spoke of my father as though he belonged to history. But as I sat beside that open footlocker, I realized he did not belong to history. He belonged to us, to my mother, to me, to the family that carried his name, to the generations who now know the sound of his heart through his handwriting. The world may remember him as one soldier among millions, but I remember him as one man who loved deeply and consistently, even in the face of uncertainty. And that is enough, returning him to the family. Not long after we found the letters, my family gathered for a small ceremony at the cemetery where he rests. On a hill where wind moves through tall grass and oak trees stand like quiet guardians. The sky was clear, the air cool, the light soft enough to feel like blessing rather than spotlight. I brought the footlocker with me, not to bury it, but to bring him with me one last time into the sunlight. I placed my hand on the headstone. Smooth marble, simple inscription. Johnnie W. Elmore, 1st Lieutenant, U.S. Army, 1913-1944. I whispered, "I found your letters." There was no dramatic feeling, no sudden flood of emotion, just peace. For 77 years, I had felt incomplete in ways I could not name, and now I was whole in ways I could not fully explain. Love had simply finished its journey, sharing the story. In the weeks that followed, I spoke with local historians and archivists who documented the discovery of the footlocker. News travelled quietly across Kentucky and beyond. People reached out, not to praise, not to pity, but to understand. Some said the story reminded them of their own parents or grandparents. Others said they, too, had names written in letters they were too young to remember. Many simply said, "Thank you for telling it, because this story is not just mine. It is the story of every family who sent someone to war, every child who grew up with a photograph instead of a person, every spouse who waited and hoped and waited still. War does not end when the fighting stops. It ends when the stories are known, when the love is remembered, when the lives are spoken aloud again. What I learned. If you asked me now what the letters gave me, I could tell you 3 things. 1, he loved us. Not vaguely, not abstractly, not just because duty said he should, but actively, personally, with intention. 2, he did not fear death. He feared being forgotten. The letters were his way of refusing to disappear. 3, I never needed to remember him, because he remembered me first, even when I was too young to recall a single moment. He held me in his thoughts, in his plans, in his daily life across an ocean. I had believed my story began in absence, but it began in love. The legacy of the letters. My grandchildren know his name now. They know he taught at Indiana University. They know he wrote letters in rain-soaked tents. They know he dreamed of coming home to rock a baby girl to sleep in the summer air of Kentucky. They know I was called Froggy. They say it with a smile, never sadness, because the letters did not return grief to us. They returned relationship. A conversation paused, not ended. A voice still speaking across time. A father who kept his promise. One day, I hope these words find you. They did. 77 years late, right on time. People often ask, do you wish the footlocker had been found sooner? I used to answer yes, but now I am not sure, because I received the letters when I was ready to receive them, when I had lived enough life to understand them, when I had learned that love can be delayed but never erased. The timing was not late, it was simply true. Time is not a straight line. It loops, it circles, it waits for us to return to what we were always meant to find. The footlocker did not arrive too late. It arrived exactly when the story was ready to be told. The last image I hold. I picture him now, not in uniform, not marching, not saluting, not standing in a snowy forest. I picture him on the back porch of his childhood home, in late summer, sleeves rolled, reading a book as his life waits gently around him. The way he was before the world changed. The way he wanted to be remembered. A man who loved and was loved. That is enough. That is all any of us can ever ask for. Closing words. If you are hearing this story tonight, I ask only one thing. Remember the people behind the dates, behind the uniforms, behind the medals, behind the telegrams. Remember the letters, the laughter, the nicknames whispered into tiny ears. Because history is not made of wars. History is made of love that survives them.